Hi everybody, this is Wanda and I just wanted to say welcome to this week's episode of Bible Briefs. I know you're here for the story, so let's get right into it. So God had warned the people from the beginning what would happen if they turned away from Him. If they wouldn't serve God, they would serve their enemies. They would be exiled from the land, and distant nations would come and lay siege to them, causing unimaginable hardship and horror. In fact, such distant nations were already rising and starting to spread out and conquer empires. Assyria was one of the cruelest in the area, so bad that God called a man named Jonah to go to the Assyrian capital of Nineveh and tell them God's judgment was coming. Jonah didn't want to do it, and went down to the port and got on a ship going as far away as possible. But God sent a storm so bad that the sailors thought they were going to die. They threw all the cargo overboard to try to help the boat stay afloat, and the crew cast lots to find out whose fault it was, and the lots said it was Jonah's fault. So Jonah confessed to the crew that he was running away from God, and the only way to make the storm stop was to throw Jonah overboard. The crew didn't want to do that, but the storm kept getting worse. So finally, they prayed to Jonah's God not to punish them for Jonah's sin or his death and tossed Jonah overboard. Immediately, the storm stopped, and all the sailors offered this God sacrifices and vowed to serve him. Meanwhile, God had a huge fish swallow Jonah, and Jonah spent 3 full days inside the fish. Then Jonah prayed to God, and God had the fish upchuck Jonah on the beach. And again, God told Jonah to go to Nineveh and proclaim his message. This time, Jonah went and proclaimed that in 40 days, Nineveh would be destroyed. And the Assyrians there believed the message. They fasted and repented and wore uncomfortable burlap clothes. Even the king did this, and he decreed that everyone must pray earnestly to God and refrain from their usual evil and violence. Maybe, if they did that, God would change his mind. And God saw how they repented and believed his word, and he didn't destroy them. But Jonah was livid, and he complained to God that this was why he didn't want to come in the first place. God was too merciful and eager to relent and not destroy people. Then Jonah built a little shelter on the east side of the city to see what would happen to the city. And God caused a plant to sprout up with nice big leaves to give Jonah shade, which Jonah really liked. But then God sent a worm that ate through the stem of the plant until it withered and there was no more shade. And while the sun was beating down on Jonah, God sent a scorching east wind as well. Jonah started feeling faint and said, "Death is certainly better than living like this." And God spoke to him again, saying, "Are you right to be so upset about the plant dying?" And Jonah is like, "Yeah, I'm upset enough to die." And God says, "You care so much for this plant, even though you did absolutely nothing for it. So shouldn't I care about a city like Nineveh with 120,000 people so lost they don't know left from right, not to mention all their animals?" And God cared even more for his people, and as the years continued, he kept sending prophets to his people. In the north, God raised up a shepherd named Amos to confront the people about how they treated each other. God's message to Amos was, "My people have forgotten how to do right. Their wealth has been stolen or taken by violence, so I'm sending an army to destroy them and plunder their fortresses." And later, "I brought hunger and famine across the land. I brought so many other disasters. But still, you wouldn't come back to me. Come back to me. Abandon your idols and live, or else I'll burn through the land like a fire and destroy you. You twist justice, treating the righteous like dirt and making life even more bitter for the oppressed. You hate honest people and honest judges so much. You charge so much in tax and rent that the poor can't afford to eat. Then you take bribes and deprive them of justice in court. Instead, do what is good and run from evil. Hate evil and love good. Let there be true justice in your courts, and God may yet have mercy on his people. Your religious festivals and gatherings are all pretense and show, and I hate them. I'm not accepting your offerings anymore, and your worship is just annoying noise. What I want from you is a flood of justice and righteousness that never stops." And God showed Amos a vision of a judgment of locusts that was coming. But Amos prayed, "Please, God, forgive us. We're so small, we'd never survive that." And God relented. And then there was a vision of fire sweeping across the land. But again, Amos interceded, and God relented. But later God showed Amos a third vision, a basket of ripe fruit, because Israel was ripe for punishment, and God wouldn't delay that punishment again. God swore that he would never forget the evil things that Israel had done. He would destroy the nation of Israel, but could never destroy the people completely. Towards the end of Amos' ministry, God called Hosea to be a prophet to Israel in a much more object manner. God told Hosea, "Go marry a woman who's going to cheat on you and have other men's children, to illustrate how the nation of Israel has prostituted itself by turning away from God and worshiping other gods." So Hosea married a woman named Gomer, who gave him a son. Then Gomer got pregnant again and had a daughter, and God told Hosea to name that daughter Not Loved, because he would no longer show love to the people of Israel, though he would still show love to Judah and rescue them from their enemies. After weaning her daughter, Gomer got pregnant again and gave birth to a son. And God said to name that son Not My People, because Israel was no longer God's people and he was no longer their God. And God later told Hosea to go and buy Gomer back, to show that he did still love Israel, even though Israel kept chasing idols. So Hosea bought her back, brought her home, and told her that she must stop her cheating, and they would live together celibately for a while. And in the same way, Israel would be without kings, princes, priests, sacrifices, or idols for a while. But after that, the people would return and devote themselves to God and David's kingship, and in the very last days they would be in awe of God and his goodness. And in those days, God promised to show love to those he said were not loved, and that instead of telling them, "You're not my people," he would say, "You are my people." Sadly, even with all of these promises and invitations, the people of Israel didn't turn back to God. And in 720 BC, the Assyrians came in, destroyed the nation, and exiled and resettled the people in other lands. Down in Judah, things weren't much better, and God raised up prophets there too. There was Micah, whose message sounded a lot like Amos's message. The rich oppress the poor and weak. The leaders are corrupt. He even says they skin people alive. They break their bones and chop them up like stew meat, doing so much evil that God wouldn't even look at them. And animal sacrifices aren't going to cut it. God has shown them what is good, and all he requires is that they do what is right and just, that they love showing mercy, and that they walk humbly before God. And it ends again with hope that God will yet show his faithful, unfailing love, the love he promised to Abraham and Jacob long ago. And he will show that love to the people again after the judgment has passed. Now, about this same time, God called one of the most famous prophets of the Old Testament, Isaiah. Isaiah had a vision the year that King Uzziah of Judah died. He saw God sitting on a throne with a robe so long it filled the whole temple. 6 winged seraphim attended him, shouting to each other, "Holy, holy, holy is God, commander of heaven's armies. The earth is filled with his glory." And their voices thundered so loud they shook the temple down to its foundations. When Isaiah saw this, he exclaimed, "It's all over for me. My lips are polluted. I come from a people whose lips are polluted, and I've seen God the King." But one of the seraphim took a burning coal from the altar and touched Isaiah's lips with it and told him he'd been cleansed and forgiven. Then Isaiah heard God asking who he should send to the people, and Isaiah said, "Send me." Isaiah was a prophet to 4 different kings of Judah. Jotham, who did what was right in God's sight, though the people remained corrupt, was the first. His son Ahaz succeeded him, and Ahaz didn't follow God at all. He made idols, gave offerings at pagan shrines, even burnt his own sons alive as sacrifices to some of those pagan gods. He tried to make a treaty with the Assyrians as they were extending their empire in that area, But when the Assyrians arrived, they attacked him instead. But no matter the hardship and trouble, Ahaz didn't turn to God. Instead, he closed the temple so no one could worship there. When Ahaz died, his son Hezekiah came to the throne. And Hezekiah was one of the godly kings. In fact, the Bible says he was more conscientious about obeying God's commands than any other king. And pretty much as soon as he takes the throne, he's on a mission to start turning the nation back to God. He reopens the temple, has the priests come and purify it. They rededicate it and start doing the daily sacrifices required by God's law. Hezekiah makes sure there are enough animals for those daily sacrifices, and God honored his obedience and made him successful in everything he did. Now Hezekiah needed all the help he could get because those Assyrians that had wiped out the northern kingdom of Israel had set their sights on Hezekiah's kingdom in Judah. In 701 BC, the Assyrian army rampaged through Judah and conquered many of the fortified towns. While laying siege to yet another town, the Assyrian king sent messengers to Jerusalem who delivered this message for King Hezekiah in the hearing of all the people. Your puny army doesn't stand a chance against us. Who do you think is going to save you? Your God? He himself has told us to attack and destroy the city. Don't fall for the lies that your God will rescue Jerusalem and save you. Just look at all the nations we've conquered. None of their gods could save them. We completely destroyed them all. What makes you think it's going to be any different for you? And the Assyrian king reiterated this in a letter to Hezekiah. And after Hezekiah read that letter, he took it to the temple, placed it before God, and he prayed, God, commander of heaven's armies, you alone are the creator, and you alone rule over all the kingdoms of the earth. So look at this and see how the king of Assyria has defied and insulted you. It's true they've conquered all these other nations and destroyed their gods, but those gods were just statues. Rescue us from them so that all the world may know that you alone are God. And God responded through Isaiah with this message. Because you have prayed about the king of Assyria, I have spoken against him. His armies won't enter Jerusalem, they won't surround it, and they won't even get close enough to shoot an arrow at it. Instead, they're going to retrace their steps all the way back home. For my honor and for the sake of my servant David, I will defend and protect this city. That same night, God sent an angel to the Assyrian camp who killed 185,000 of them. When the remaining Assyrians woke up the next morning and saw all the dead bodies, the king took his army and hightailed it all the way back to Nineveh and stayed there. Until one day, while worshiping in the temple of one of his gods, the Assyrian king was assassinated by two of his sons. Now, about this same time, Hezekiah also became deathly ill. So ill that the prophet Isaiah came to see him and told him, God says, get your affairs in order. You're not going to get better. But as soon as Isaiah left, Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and prayed, God, remember me, how I've always faithfully and single-mindedly served you and done what pleases you. Before he just broke down in tears. And you guys, Isaiah didn't even have time to get off the palace grounds before God spoke to him again and said, go back to Hezekiah and tell him that I've heard his prayers and seen his tears. So I'm going to heal him and give him 15 more years of life. Isaiah delivered the message, and Hezekiah recovered and continued his reign. But after Hezekiah died, his 12-year-old son Manasseh became king. And he did even more evil against the Lord than his grandfather Ahaz had done, setting up idols and pagan altars in the temple itself, sacrificing his sons to pagan gods, and practicing all kinds of sorcery, divination, and witchcraft. His reign lasted over half a century, and Manasseh was even more wicked than the people the Israelites drove out of the land when they first conquered it. And he caused the people to join in such evil. So God decreed that he was going to bring such terrible disaster on Jerusalem and Judah that even those who just heard about it would be horrified. Even those who survived the destruction would be handed over to their enemies. The people continued in their evil, and this particularly vexed a prophet named Habakkuk, who questioned God about why he didn't do anything about the evil, destruction, and violence that were rampant among his people. And God said he was going to do something unbelievable. He was going to raise up the Babylonians to punish the nation for its great evil. And this doesn't make any sense to Habakkuk. How could a holy God work through such an evil people, or allow them to execute judgment on those more righteous than they themselves were? But God simply says that the Babylonians will be conquered in their turn, and so they would suffer the just judgment of God in their time as well. And Habakkuk concludes that he will wait patiently for the disaster God has promised to send on the invaders. And so even if there were no food, no figs or grapes, no olives or grain in the fields, if the sheep were all scattered and the cattle barns empty, he would be joyful in God, his strength. Habakkuk may have found a way to be joyful in those dark days, but his fellow prophet Jeremiah had a more difficult time of it. But then Jeremiah was getting messages from God like, even if Moses and Samuel were to intercede for the nation, I wouldn't help them. Get them out of my sight. Because of the evil things Manasseh did, I'm going to make an example of my people that horrifies the rest of the world. Or, I will shatter the people of Judah beyond all hope of repair and make their whole city like a garbage dump. And of course, with messages like that, no one wanted to hear what Jeremiah had to say. The king burned a scroll full of Jeremiah's prophecies. Sometime after that, the next king allowed his officials to imprison Jeremiah in an empty well because they were afraid his messages would demoralize the few people that were left in Judah. But Jeremiah's message remained the same. Again and again, God had sent prophets to tell the people to turn from their evil ways and to stop worshiping idols. But they wouldn't listen and kept on with their idols. So they'd brought this disaster upon themselves. And now God was sending Babylon to completely destroy them. They would be taken into captivity for 70 years, and the land would be a desolate waste during that time. Then Babylon itself would be conquered. The Babylonians came, and every time the king thought he didn't have to serve or pay tribute to Babylon, the Babylonians came back and took more people and more riches back to Babylon with them. And after many of the people had been exiled, but Jerusalem still stood, God sent a message to the exiles through Jeremiah that said they were to settle in, build homes, plant gardens, have families, children, grandchildren, and multiply. And they were to pray for and work for the prosperity of that place. They were going to be there for 70 years, but God was going to bring them home again. Eventually, the Babylonians got tired of coming back to put down defiance and did completely destroy Jerusalem, leveling the walls, plundering the beautiful temple Solomon had built for God, and burning everything to the ground. And Jeremiah wrote the book of Lamentations in sorrow for the loss of the great city and the nation. There was also a prophet among the exiles named Ezekiel, and I'll be real honest, I always think of Ezekiel as the prophet that God made see and do weird stuff. His story starts on July 31st, 593 BC, and yes, my Bible said they could actually date it that exactly from cross-checking with other archaeological records. He was called when God gave him a vision where he saw a big cloud with flashing lightning all around and a brilliant glow and fire within. Then out of the middle of the cloud came creatures that looked kind of like humans with 4 faces: a lion face, an ox face, a human face, and an eagle face, and 4 wings with human hands underneath the wings, and bronze hooves where their feet should be. Then next to each one of them there were wheels, with other wheels crosswise inside them, and the whole wheel was covered with eyes. And above all that was what looked like a man made of fire on a throne, who spoke to him and told him that he was being sent to Israel, and then gives him a scroll to eat. And shortly after that, God told Ezekiel to symbolize the coming siege of Jerusalem by lying on his side for over a year and eating bread he cooked using human poop as fuel. But the human poop part would be defiling, and when Ezekiel protested, God allowed him to use cow poo instead. Later, Ezekiel has visions of God's glory leaving the temple and the glory leaving the city of Jerusalem, multiple messages personifying Israel and Judah as prostitutes. God forbids Ezekiel from mourning his wife's death. And probably the most famous passage from the book of Ezekiel, he has a vision of a valley of dry bones. And as he prophesies to them, The skeletons come together, then grow flesh. Then God tells him to prophesy to the wind, to put breath into them and make them live again. And they stand up and become a mighty army of living people. And these bones represented God's people Israel, who felt like they and their hope were dead and gone. But God was going to make them live again. Though the nations of Israel and Judah had been destroyed, God would preserve his chosen people, and he would also continue to use them to reveal himself to the rest of the world, as he did with a young captive named Daniel, who we'll focus on next week. Now that the story's over, it's time for our processing questions. So, here are our processing questions. Feel free to think through them yourself, or if you're listening to this with a group, pause the audio and talk amongst yourselves about these. What did you like about this story? What did you not like or find confusing and uncomfortable in this story? What did you learn about God from this story? What did you learn about people from this story? And what does God want you to do in light of this story? Now, there's just one last thing before you go, and that is if you are enjoying this series and you find it beneficial, I'd really appreciate it if you would like, subscribe, and share this with your friends. And I will catch you on the next episode of Bible Briefs.